Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Michael Lawrence. Welcome to Asia House and the launch of our annual Outlook for 2024. We are honoured to have such a distinguished audience with us today. It includes some 14 heads of missions from embassies and high commissions here in London, including His Excellency Zhong Zhaguan, who's China's ambassador to the UK, and who will very shortly be delivering our opening keynote address. We also have with us representatives from a further 14 nations, so it's a truly global audience. Thanks all for being here. We will shortly welcome the UK Minister of State for the Indo-Pacific, Anne-Marie Trevelyan, who is running a little late. She was on an overnight flight from the US, so no doubt the weather and the traffic has slowed her down, but she should be with us in about 15 or 20 minutes, and she too will be delivering a speech. So thank you all for being here. Now, aside from the packed room here, we probably have several hundred people dialing in on Zoom. Thank you too for joining us. We're going to present the key findings of the Asia House Annual Outlook just a little later. It's now available online, and there's a QR code on the screen. And for those in the room, we've put hard copies on your chairs. Just a few headlines to set the scene for today's program. Asia will be the world's growth engine for 2024. As a region, it's likely to deliver growth of around 5%, and a number of the 8 countries that we assessed are on track to outperform that average. Accelerated digital transformation, a rise in regional trade, and an expansion of the availability of green finance will underpin that growth. The outlook also concludes that the fundamentals in Asia are strong, and it's well placed to withstand any global shocks that transpire in what's likely to be a turbulent year. This is a so-called super election year, billions going to the polls, India, Indonesia, and the US among them. The macroeconomic environment is challenging. Growth in developed economies is modest at best. Inflation remains stubbornly high, and while interest rates may have peaked, there's a lot of debate about the timing and pace of rate reductions. The Russia-Ukraine and Middle East conflicts and their repercussions globally suggest a year of escalating geopolitical tensions and volatile markets. But against that background, the Asia House Outlook concludes that Asia's economies and regional trade will continue to grow and do so robustly. It's often been said in recent years that the centre of economic gravity is shifting towards Asia. Well, we see this shift as accelerating in 2024, and that is the theme of today's discussion. But to get us underway, I would like to invite to the stage the chairman of Asia House, Lord Stephen Green, who will formally welcome our keynote speaker. Lord Green.
Michael, thank you, and as ever, it's a great pleasure to be here and to see so many people here. This is an important occasion for Asia House, and it's a great honour for me to be in the position of welcoming His Excellency Ambassador Zhong, which I will get around to in a second. I wanted just first to say that the scenario that Michael has just sketched for you is one which sits, in our view, in a wider context of a shift from west to east, of a shift from a world which, when most of us were starting out our working careers or growing up, we will remember as a bipolar world, the world being the world dominated by the US and the Soviet Union. That was followed, not for very long, by a unipolar world when America seemed to be the dominant power on the world stage. And we're now moving very clearly into what I think is best described as a multipolar world, a world where there are a number of important countries on the world stage, but of course more and more countries, large or small, are finding their voice and delivering economic progress to their peoples in a way which is, for all of the challenges, frankly very exciting. That's the world in which we now live. That's the world which we expect over the next 20, 30, 40 years. And Asia is central to that story. Asia is, as Michael has already sketched out, the driver of world economic growth, not only in the year 2024, but actually for the foreseeable future. And of course, it's growing in influence in all sorts of ways. China, India, the Gulf states, are important actors on the world stage in the way which would not have been true 25 years ago. Growing in sophistication too, of course. Economies which in many cases started on their road of economic development through the textile industry, through plastics, through those traditional ways into economic modernization, are now themselves extremely sophisticated, technologically leading-edge economies. When you think of the tech sector itself, you think of aerospace, but you also think more broadly of the way in which Asian countries are becoming exporters of culture, exporters of pop culture. Think of the Koreans and the extraordinary success they have had in the pop world in the last few years. It's really quite recent, but the momentum is very strong. And think too of all those remarkable performers of classical music who now are so prominent on the stage globally in that area of activity. So it's not just about raw economics, though that is important and indeed underlies everything else. It's also about a much broader engagement, which those of us who grew up in Europe or in North America need to come to terms with. Recognize that the world is changing, recognize that we have tremendous opportunities in this more exciting multipolar world. It used to be said that when America sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. Nowadays, you don't want America to sneeze, for sure. America has not become an unimportant economy. You don't want it to sneeze. But what is true now is that Asia has an awful lot of internal momentum. It's almost as if you thought of Asia as one big domestic market, it's got so much momentum of its own that America could sneeze and actually Asia's growth would continue. The momentum would continue. When Europe stagnates, Asia has momentum, a continental momentum, which will continue. As far as here in London is concerned, we the British are concerned, I think one of the best things that our government has done recently was to apply successfully to join the CCTPP. That's a great statement of a national policy of engagement with the exciting developments in Asia. And by the way, this afternoon I will be down in the House of Lords watching what I hope will be the final stage in the approval of the Act which allows the UK to ratify its own membership. There we go. Many transformations underway. There is, of course, nothing more dramatic than the way in which China has transformed its economy, transformed the lives of hundreds of millions of its people, and taken its responsible place on the world stage. This is quite close to the Year of the Dragon. We're not quite there yet, but the excitement is building. And in that context, it's my huge privilege to welcome His Excellency Ambassador Zheng Zheguang to the stage to give us a keynote address. Ambassador.
Thank you, Lord Green, Mr. Lawrence, Chairman Barton, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great pleasure to be here for the Asia House Annual Outlook launch. With the Chinese New Year, the Year of the Dragon, just around the corner, this event could not have come at a better time. I'd like to thank the Asia House and its members for your long-standing efforts in promoting understanding and mutually beneficial cooperation between China, Asia, and the UK. In 2023, we witnessed accelerating upheaval in the world. And with the elections unfolding in so many places, 2024 is bound to face even more uncertainties and turbulence. The global situation further confirms President Xi Jinping's assessment, that is, changes in the world of the times and of history are playing out like never before, and the world has entered a new period of turbulence and transformation. Yet, it is China's conviction that the overall direction of human progress, the overall dynamics of world history moving forward amid twists and turns, and the overall trend towards a shared future for international community all remain unchanged. So how to tackle an increasingly complex external environment? Here's China's approach. At home, we will stay the course of high-quality development and advance the building of a strong nation and national rejuvenation through the Chinese path to modernization. And internationally, we call for an equal and orderly multipolar world and a universally beneficial and inclusive economic globalization. We call on all countries to work together to build a community with a shared future. The year 2023 saw China continuing to be a key engine for the world economy. With the challenges we faced, our GDP grew by 5.2% year on year, ranking among the fastest of the world's major economies. Internal drivers were stronger, and domestic demand contributed more than 110% of the growth. Despite weak external demand, China's total import and export goods increased by 0.2%. In the first 11 months of last year, the number of newly established foreign invested enterprises in China actually grew by over 36% year on year. The economy has become more digitalized and greener. Investment in high-tech industries increased by 10.3%, and foreign demand for the new threes, namely new energy vehicles, lithium-ion batteries, and photovoltaic products grew rapidly, and their exports, is the first time in history, exceeded 1 trillion RMB yuan. China's contribution to global economic growth once again exceeds 30%, conveying a very clear message to the world. Betting against China has never succeeded in the past and will not succeed in the future. Looking ahead, there will be headwinds in the year 2024. For example, external demand will continue to be weak, probably. The uncertainties that we're confronted with in so many places of the world. And we need to double our efforts in stabilizing the market and restore the confidence in the capital market while sorting out the problems in the real estate sector. But the long-term trajectory of China's development remains very positive. Our confidence comes from at least the following 5 areas. First, China's strong political leadership and the consistency of major policies. Second, the demand generated by a supersized market of more than 1.4 billion people, with 400 million of them are already middle incomers. Third, the supply supported by a fully fledged industrial system. As you know, China is the only country in the world with industries across all categories in the United Nations Industrial Classification. Fourth, abundant talent, capital, and data resources. And finally, innovation underpinned by the rapid development of high-tech industries. China is now home to 400,000 high-tech enterprises, and the number of unicorn companies in the country ranks second globally. As Premier Li Qiang noted in his special address at Davos 2024, China is firmly committed to opening up. As a major trading partner of over 140 countries and regions, China's overall tariff level has been cut to 7.3%. In the past 5 years, the return on FDI investment in China stands at around 9%, which is quite competitive globally. In the following 5 years, China is projected to import $17 trillion worth of goods and services. China will continue to foster a market-oriented, law-based, and world-class business environment. Its door will open even wider to the world, and business from all countries, including here in the United Kingdom, are welcome to expand their cooperation in our country. Ladies and gentlemen, the Asia-Pacific is the region with the fastest growth and the greatest potential and the most dynamic cooperation in the world. As an important member of the Asia-Pacific family, China has always been a staunch force for peace, stability, and prosperity in the region. We follow the principle of amity, sincerity, mutual benefit, and inclusiveness, and work to build friendship and partnership with neighboring countries. During President Xi Jinping's state visit to Vietnam last month, the two sides agreed to build a community with a shared future that carries strategic significance. We actively promote the peaceful resolution of regional hotspot issues. Recently, under China's mediation, relevant parties in Myanmar signed a temporary ceasefire agreement in Kunming. For many years now, China has been a powerful economic propeller in the region, contributing over 64% to regional economic growth in the year 2022. China is firmly committed in regional economic cooperation and integration. We are dedicated to major regional multilateral mechanisms such as 10+1, 10+3, APEC, and RCEP. We have always supported ASEAN centrality in regional cooperation. Peace, stability, and prosperity in the Asia-Pacific bears on not only the future of the region itself, but that of the whole world. Amid changes unseen in a century, China will deepen dialogue and cooperation with all parties towards the goal of building an Asia-Pacific community with a shared future. Now, to achieve this goal, we call on all parties to follow the following principles. First, respecting each other. Now, mutual respect for core interests and major concerns is the very basis for political mutual trust between countries. The Taiwan question is at the core of China's core interests. The result of the elections on Taiwan Island not long ago has in no way changed the basic fact that Taiwan is part of China and there is only one China in the world. It has never changed the universal commitment of the international community to the one China principle. And it has never changed the historical trend that China will finally, eventually be reunified. China will continue to strive for peaceful reunification with the greatest sincerity and the utmost effort. But we will do whatever it takes to thwart any attempt for Taiwan independence and any interference from external forces. Second, upholding peace. The world is chaotic enough, so the peace and stability in the Asia-Pacific region need to be cherished even more. We stand ready to work with regional countries to apply the Global Security Initiative and are resolutely opposed to exclusive circles or blocs by some countries, such as AUKUS. Such blocs are not conducive to regional stability and will only create division and frictions. On the South China Sea, China remains steadfast in defending our territorial sovereignty and maritime rights and interests. At the same time, we are firmly committed to properly handling differences through dialogue and consultation with the parties directly concerned. China opposes any actions by any country aimed at sowing discord and instigating trouble in South China Sea. Now recently, the 8th meeting of China-Philippines bilateral consultation mechanism on the South China Sea was held in Shanghai. The two sides had a candid and in-depth exchange of views on the situation in the South China Sea and maritime issues of their respective concern. Both sides agreed to properly manage relevant disagreements and create favorable conditions for the sound and stable development of China-Philippines relations. Third, championing openness and cooperation. All countries should oppose CITEC and economic blockade or decoupling. For such moves will only undermine the stability of industrial and supply chains and jeopardize regional prosperity. We will continue to work with all parties to implement the Global Development Initiative, promote high-quality development, high-quality Belt and Road cooperation, and strive to complete version 3.0 ASEAN-China FTA negotiations this year. We will work actively towards joining the CPTPP and strengthen cooperation with regional countries on digital economy and green development. Fourth, embracing exchanges and mutual learning. Amity between the people holds the key to sound state-to-state relations. China will continue to work with countries in the region to implement the Global Civilization Initiative and strengthen the sharing of experience in governance, enhance engagement with different sectors of the society, and bolster public support for relations among regional countries. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the United Kingdom has long been an active participant in Asia-Pacific affairs, despite the geographical distance. The UK will hold its general election in the year 2024. Now, whoever wins the election, I hope the UK will have a good grasp of the mega trends in the Asia-Pacific and play a constructive role in promoting peace, stability, and prosperity in the region. Now, China follows a consistent policy towards the UK, continuing to seek a relationship based on mutual respect, non-interference in each other's internal affairs, and win-win cooperation. We see great potentials in our bilateral economic, educational, and cultural tourism cooperation. We are already close partners, and we're working together to meet the common challenges such as climate change, the loss of biodiversity. But we also see great potential for China and the UK in working for peace, stability, and prosperity in the Asia-Pacific. The two countries should enhance understanding, avoid misjudgment and misperception, and increase mutual trust through dialogue. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we will soon usher in the Chinese New Year, the year of dragon. Dragon in the Chinese culture symbolizes fortitude, wisdom, and auspiciousness. Now, in the spirit of the Chinese Spring Festival, I wish you all more wisdom, greater success, and more happiness in the year ahead. Thank you so much.
Ambassador, thank you very much indeed. We'll now have a quick look at some of the highlights, the key findings of the report. I'll invite to the stage Zuchen Mao, who's Asia House's Head of Research and Advisory, to give you a briefing on some of those key points. Zuchen.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael. Good morning, all. So I'll be spending the next 5 minutes or so to briefly highlight some of the key findings of the 2024 Asia House Annual Outlook. One of the key, very first key findings of the report is that Asia will once again be the engine of growth in 2024, where the region is expected to grow by around 5%, outperforming much of the developed economies. And we see Asia's economic resilience this year rooted in three main drivers, which are technological advancement, green finance, and regional trade. There are also both political and economic risks we have identified in the region, which I will elaborate on a little bit later on. However, we do see that Asia's growth will remain robust despite these risks and uncertainties. On the first driver in technological advancement, the report see that the expansion of digitalization and technological innovation as essential. That in turn will drive growth in the region and catalyze productivity as well as income growth that is necessary to create a higher level of income. In particular, the report has identified 4 pathways and channels that are significant for the region's growth. Starting with first, blockchain technology, where its use in specific sectors will bring improved efficiencies, and the technology can be particularly useful, for instance, in cross-border trade, in data reporting and management. Hence, the application of blockchain technology is likely to grow in breadth and in scale. The second pathway is data sharing and digitalization, which will help increase transparency and reduce processing time, cost, and as well as risks. Also, richer data can offer better insights into supply chains that will help, for instance, trade finance more efficient and more accessible for corporates, particularly for small and medium-sized enterprises. The third is artificial intelligence, where the report specifically touched upon the impact of AI on productivity in certain sectors and how the development of AI in the region can scale up and benefit from a large pool of data, given that in already mature digital economy in some of the Asian countries. And lastly, the last pathway is the development of central bank digital currencies that will drive financial inclusion for SMEs, which account of a significant share of employment and output in Asia, but tend to struggle obtain affordable trade financing. So by emphasizing the development of CDBC, it will help facilitate the region's overall growth. On the second theme of Asia House Annual Outlook, which is green finance, the report has looked at the ways in which Asian economies are seeking to entrench growth in green finance to propel investments in renewables and as well as carbon markets. There are three enabling factors. Starting with first is financial stability, where macroprudential policies implemented by many of the Asian economies will continue to reduce vulnerabilities and spillover risks. The second enabling factor is greater policy coordination between public and private sectors, which will increase in 2024 and thereby strengthen policy momentum on green finance. Thirdly, the report sees state-owned enterprises as key to the scaling up of Asia's green finance, given their share of, for instance, infrastructure investments and domestic output, as well as presence in some of the key renewable sectors. There are multiple risks, both political and economic, facing Asia in 2024, yet these risks are likely to be mitigated by the region's economic resilience. Starting with a series of key elections around the world in 2024, the outcome of these elections, particularly in the US, will likely to influence and possibly reshape the geopolitical landscape going forward. And what makes the number of elections this year particularly consequential is the fact that they are taking place on the back of several global challenges, such as an economic slowdown, uncertainties around global price stabilities, and as well as consumer cost living pressure, which will persist despite some signs of softening. So related to the global uncertainties, the volatility in the U.S. Interest rate expectations is likely to create an uncertain financial conditions this year, especially in economies where high levels of, in economies with high level of U.S. dollar debt. And finally, the impact of tensions and conflicts in the Middle East, which has injected greater volatility in global energy markets, while attacks on commercial shippings in Red Sea has significantly increased the risk of disruptions in global trade. Therefore, any further escalations in geopolitical risks in the Middle East is likely to have detrimental impact on the global economic outlook and the knock-on effects on Asia. I will now end the presentation with the country analysis of the report, which focuses on major economies in Asia, which are China, Japan, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, the Philippines, and as well as Vietnam. So in both Vietnam and the Philippines, we see the economy will continue to outperform its regional neighbors in 2024, while growth in Indonesia and India will be strong and resilient. Malaysia is on track to deliver a 5% growth rate, and Thailand could see a pickup in growth to around 3.2%. And finally, China's economy will grow by 4.5% despite a potential slowdown. So I will stop here, and you can find more details about some of the key themes of the Asia House Annual Outlook in the report. Thank you very much.
Jishan, thank you very much. It's now my great pleasure to welcome back to Asia House Anne-Marie Trevelyan, the UK's Minister of State for the Indo-Pacific, who's rushed here from Heathrow, and thank you very much for taking the time to be here. Welcome, Anne-Marie Trevelyan.
Thank you, Michael, and apologies for being late. The blessings of snow in DC BA engineers, and then the traffic coming in from Heathrow. It's a joy, isn't it? I can get home just as quickly, I think, as I can get here. But it's the one upside of being the second on the programme instead of the first, which, Ambassador, apologies, that I now get to see the report, because I was actually giving a speech on the back of having not seen it, because you wouldn't let me see it before, Michael. So thank you for that, and it's a real pleasure to be here again for the launch, gosh, is it in a blink of an eye, isn't it? The 2024 Outlook. And it really doesn't seem like a year since I was standing at this lectern predicting, I think as I was, months of change ahead. But I wasn't entirely wrong, because it indeed has been a busy year and an awful lot has happened. Now, we did know even then that we were going to be looking at an unpredictable year, but I'm not sure that any of us would have anticipated the scale of events that has impacted economies over the last year. From the continuing challenges around climate change to cybersecurity, from the conflicts in Ukraine, which continue to create huge strains, and of course in Gaza, US-China competition, the really substantial impacts we're seeing through BRICS expansion, and of course the Saudi-Iran deal. And not wishing to be a predictor, I think 2024 is probably going to be equally unpredictable. As you mentioned, we've got elections in 60 countries, over 2 billion people going to the polls, which is an extraordinary, thing when you think about that sort of voice being spoken from citizens across the world. It's actually a global first, from Bangladesh and Taiwan in the last few weeks to India, Indonesia, South Korea, Sri Lanka, our own UK general election at some point. I can give you no inside information. And of course, at the end of the year, the US's presidential election. So I think Lord Green is right to talk about turbulence in the coming year, but there will be two things that will remain consistent in 2024. One of those is Asian growth, and the other one is the UK's commitment to be at the heart of that. So we're going to be continuing to seek those deeper partnerships with all these amazing countries across the Indo-Pacific, and with the regional network in partnership with ASEAN, the Indian Ocean Rim Association, and the Pacific Islands Forum, amongst others. I had the great pleasure to attend the IORA Ministerial in Colombo in October last year, and indeed the Pacific Islands Forum in the Cook Islands in November. I spend a lot of time on planes these days, some of which work better than others. I think what I've heard time and time again from my counterparts, in spite of their very diverse interests, was a desire for the kind of stable world order that will support economic growth and genuinely allow sustainable development. Because that stable world order in which we can all win that race for climate security and, of course, for health security, and a stable world order that gets that prosperity that every country needs back on track. Now, the Foreign Secretary has called this an age of insecurity, and that insecurity can fan out both by land and by sea. And of course, the recent situations in the Red Sea are a blunt reminder of what that looks like. Something that became particularly stark in 2023 is that Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific security are clearly inseparable. Understanding that, and for that reason, that's why the UK and so many of our partners want to be part of sustaining a free and open Indo-Pacific. Simply put, it's in our interest for the Indo-Pacific to be secure and stable, and it's in the interest of the region's people to build a free, fair future where top quality trade rules are respected, trade routes can stay open, data and energies can flow freely, and countries have free choices. So the UK's deployment of HMS Diamond in support of Operation Prosperity Guardian, an international task force to protect commercial shipping in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, is perhaps a clear example of the UK's intent. On maritime security, I'm looking forward to continuing engagement with the AUKUS partnership this year, as well as working with some key Indo-Pacific partners to assure global waters are safer for everyone. The UK knows that security and trade will form a virtuous circle in our relationships throughout Asia. In 2023, we saw a number of notable successes for this approach as we signed our accession protocol to the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. I can do that even on no sleep, as impressive as that. CPTPP. That was in July. Now, joining CPTPP is going to give UK businesses an extraordinarily exciting enhanced access to the Malaysian market for the first time, and it puts the UK at the heart of our dynamic group of free trading countries, which are in the right place and at the right time. And we, of course, have our free trade agreements with Australia and New Zealand, which came into force last year, with an expectation to increase bilateral trade by 53% and 59% respectively over the long term. And in May, we announced the expansion of British International Investments, BII as it's known, to the Indo-Pacific, which is going to invest up to £500 million of climate finance. And we've also agreed the Singapore-UK Green Economy Framework, MOU. These are pillars, if you like, in the UK's continuing growth and development of that commitment to the Indo-Pacific. More widely in support of regional security and stability, we've agreed a reciprocal access agreement with Japan in January last year. The UK is the first European country to agree an RAA with Japan, which is enabling both countries to undertake longer, larger, more frequent and more complex joint exercising. And we're also sharing our cutting-edge technology through the Global Combat Air Programme, GCAP for short, to strengthen our deterrence and defence. And the signing of the GCAP treaty with Japan and Italy in December was a really important milestone for that. We've also been strengthening important bilateral relationships with the new strategic partnership with Singapore and the Downing Street Accord with the Republic of Korea. The Downing Street Accord commits both sides to deeper cooperation on defence and security, on trade and investment, on science and technology, and on wider global issues together. Now, all of these relationships require a degree of trust. Trust that there are certain rules of engagement that the parties agree to follow. 2023 saw an important moment in this regard as the UK, China and 27 other countries signed the Bletchley Declaration on the AI Safety Summit to voice our mutual concern at the dangers of unfettered AI development and to work together on safety research. This work is a cornerstone of the UK's leadership in digital transformation as we carve out our role in a new technical world this year. 2023 also saw publication of the UK Government's Integrated Review Refresh, which set out the UK's approach to global threats more widely, as well as our approach to the UK-China relationship. As permanent members of the UN Security Council together, each with a powerful global reach, the UK's relationship with China has enormous potential to overcome some of the greatest global challenges together. So I welcome China's attendance at the AI Summit and also the UK-China engagement on climate change at COP28. The COVID pandemic has taught us that it is prudent to reduce dependencies in our critical supply chains. But we do believe that a positive trade and investment relationship with China is also critically important for both our countries' interests. So we must maintain open channels to discuss all areas of our relationship, including where we have concerns. That includes the deterioration of freedoms in Hong Kong and the need to preserve peace in the South China Sea and Taiwan Strait. These are matters of global interest, and so following Taiwan's recent elections, I hope that those on both sides of the strait will renew efforts to resolve differences through constructive dialogue. It is important that engagement between the UK and China continues to grow throughout 2024, and I'm very pleased to be joined here today by our esteemed colleague, His Excellency. Looking to the opportunities to come, Outlook 2024, for which I've had a quick look now, thank you, rightly notes the importance of digital transformation to support economic growth. We know that AI and other critical technologies have the potential to transform our societies and improve the lives of millions. So we will build on the AI Safety Summit and continue to spur collective international action to navigate both the opportunities and the risks of this new frontier. We seek to ensure public safety, to drive commercial benefits, and to promote values in line with our democratic ideals, assisting businesses in the process. On trade, we've continued negotiations on our UK-India Free Trade Agreement, a deal to boost our current trading relationship, already worth £38 billion, and we're working to upgrade the UK-Korea FTA, as announced during the recent state visit, to enhance our existing £18 billion trade relationship with South Korea. And of course, our ambition is to complete the required domestic procedures to join CPTPP as soon as possible, with the aim of completing that in the second half of this year. This is all before we mention the long-term benefits that membership of CPTPP presents for the UK. That stronger voice to shape global standards in areas like digital trade, more resilience and security in our supply chains, and more opportunities for jobs and growth right across the UK. And, as Asia House correctly foresees, this will likely be a turbulent year. Therefore, 2024 also needs to be a year of patient diplomacy, as we continue to put in place these long-term frameworks that will build the range of partnerships required to protect UK prosperity and security, and to support global efforts to tackle those shared challenges, whether those frameworks are FTAs, defence and security arrangements, or innovative approaches to mitigating the impacts of climate change. So it is my great honour as Minister for the Indo-Pacific and our superb team of ambassadors and high commissioners around the world to understand our partners' priorities and to respond to them and work with you. We will encourage and work with our brilliant businesses, our investors, our entrepreneurs and their counterparts across the region to maximise these opportunities for 2024 and for the long term. Thank you.
Minister, thank you very much. Now we're going to explore a couple of the themes of the report. In a few moments we'll look at the digital and technology side of it, but first I want to talk about some of the key risks. And they're multiple, as we went through earlier. I'd like to invite to the stage now Ginny Yan. Ginny is the Chief China Economist at ICBC Standard Bank. And from Singapore, we're going to be joined by Zaid Haider, who's Global Director of Geopolitical Risk at McKinsey & Co. Thank you both for joining us. Ziad, if I may start with you. Sitting in Asia, you're in Singapore at the moment, I believe. What's the biggest geopolitical risk, or the top two risks that you see from that perspective?
Well, Michael, thank you. Firstly, it's great to be back here. Happy New Year to all, and happy Chinese New Year right around the corner. I think it is very hard to answer that question succinctly, and I say that because there is a bit of a polycrisis, plethora of geopolitical risks that we're dealing with. I like to think of it at multiple levels. I think it is important to hold into our mind the sort of silver linings here and the positive story that was laid out in your report. One of the facts that wasn't in there that I think is very powerful in Asia is the fact that 60% of trade in Asia by Asian countries is happening within Asia. So the ties that bind in this region are quite strong. But having said that, turning to the risks, I think the first is sort of this category of geopolitical flashpoints, whether it's the question of the conflict in the Middle East and the way that might escalate, linking that practically to Asia. A ship that used to take 26 days from Singapore to Rotterdam now takes 36 days. And there's been a 173% increase in freight rates since the disruptions we've seen in the Red Sea. If you look at the Russia-Ukraine conflict, even though the inflationary pressures in some regards have eased, the principle of international law and sovereignty resonates deeply with many Asian governments. Notably, Singapore, Japan have taken quite strong stances. So that does continue to resonate and be an issue in the minds of policymakers and business. And then, of course, there's US-China and the sort of unfolding strategic competition, where the Singapore foreign minister, I think, eloquently captured when he referred to the fact that in many ways the weather has fortunately improved. Both leaders met at APEC in San Francisco and set, in a sense, a floor for the relationship. But while that weather has improved, the climate fundamentally hasn't. I think we're in for a period of continued competition, and how that plays out in an election year in the US is a factor for businesses. But Michael, that's really just one level. There's been a lot of discussion then below those fractures in the geopolitical landscape about these fissures of national elections. And I think the important point there is it's easy to get lost in the numbers of elections and the numbers of people voting. I'd point to two different things that are more important. One is which are going to be the elections that lead to continuity and which are the ones that are going to lead to discontinuity. Because there's a significant number of these elections that are not going to lead to discontinuity, we know who will probably prevail. So that's one point, which are the ones of discontinuity. And then the second, which is again an emerging feature already this year in these elections, is the role of AI. We are seeing this in Pakistan. I was just there last week with Imran Khan leveraging this technology to speak to his voters on Facebook. We're seeing it in Indonesia with deepfake videos. So I wouldn't so much focus on the aggregate number of elections as much as these cuts at which are the ones of discontinuity and what are we going to learn about the role of AI in politics in the world. Below that level, Michael, of national elections, there's the things that go overlooked often, which is, I would say, the flow of people, of climate, of civil conflict. There are no shortage of those around the world. They're of longer and longer intensity. I sit on the board of the International Rescue Committee, so we happen as a board to focus quite a lot on how can we be a solution to this. But the world's longest running civil war is right here in Asia, in Myanmar. And if we look at the displacement happening right there, right now as we speak, it's quite significant, but often overlooked. So there is that level of geopolitical risk that continues. But maybe I'll just round out with this, which is if you think of these fractures of Russia, Ukraine, the Middle East, US, China, you think of the fissures of the elections and these sort of flows of people and conflict and climate change, there is something below all of that, which is tectonic plate shifts, essentially, to keep on playing with that theme of geo. And those tectonic plate shifts have been referred to as a more multipolar world. That in itself is worth a seminar. Are we truly in a multipolar world? From a military lens, we are not. The US remains preeminent. From an economic lens, it feels quite tripolar, the US, EU, China. But from a political lens, it is multipolar. There are a rise of these sort of suite of middle power countries that are flexing their muscle, or as the Indian foreign minister called it, external affairs minister said, practicing forms of multi-vector diplomacy. And at McKinsey, we just released a report just last week at Davos about a global cooperation and measuring it on 6 different dimensions. And the one that is eroded the quickest in the last few years is around peace and security. So that, multipolarity and that tectonic shift is going to create tremendous opportunity for countries that did not have a voice in the international system. That's worth acknowledging. But at the same time, it is going to make it much harder to tackle the raft of issues that I just stacked above the tectonic plates.
Sure. I'd like to come back to some of that and explore that in a bit more detail in a moment. Huge amount to digest there. Jeannie, come to you and let's look at it from the macroeconomic picture. It's an uncertain time. I mean, it looks like inflation may have peaked, still not quite sure. Interest rates may have peaked, but the outlook on rates has changed dramatically since before Christmas to after Christmas. In terms of macroeconomic risks, particularly related to Asia, where do you see the biggest?
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, and I think there's been so many very interesting topics. Of course, Your Excellency talked a lot already about China's economy. Globally, we're facing very similar risks. We had high and sticky inflation, and probably 2024, we're talking about sticky inflation.
Yeah.
And how particularly monetary policy will answer to the fact that inflation will be with us potentially for some time, especially with the Middle East tensions, Russia-Ukraine still ongoing. So how we factor that in? So for me, whether it's talking about China or globally, because we talk about risk and this panel's about risk, but in Chinese, risk comes opportunity. So we talk about geopolitical risk a lot, but do we talk enough about geopolitical opportunity as well? Same with macroeconomic factors. So for me, the key, risks for China and macroeconomics, for China domestic, I think number one is the fact that I think structural challenges, particularly demographics, is upon us. And I think China's economic transition really depends on how much upskilling and how much a skilled labor force could really happen. And that is why technology, and that's why we talk about technology and digitization so much, is because we need AI technology to increase productivity. Secondly, I think it's that policy coordination, and we talked about continuity. In China, I think when we talk to clients, particularly foreign clients and institutional investors looking at China, they are looking for quality growth. I know our Asia House report talk a lot about GDP growth and all of those projections. But for China, more and more so, and we hear policymakers talking about this, is what matters now is quality of growth. 5% today, high quality growth matters more than double-digit growth previously. So that flight to quality, whether it's quality of assets, quality of growth, quality of skills is increasingly important. So with the risk of slowing GDP growth in China and globally, we're facing sticky inflation, but also low growth environment, lack of demand, lack of investment. And the opportunity is in that environment, how do you produce high quality? How do you increase productivity with that? And last but not least, supply chain disruptions. And I think this is where geopolitics ties in. If we have China increasingly such a crucial part of global supply chains, and of course its largest trading partner now, ASEAN, and the rest of Asia Pacific, which plays a huge role in global supply chains. We learned about that in COVID's period. How do you retain your resilience throughout that period? I think it's going to be an opportunity too for not just China, Asian participants in the global supply chain, but globally. How do you increase your resilience? How do you diversify away from potentially some of the sectors that you depend on?
Okay, so Ed, back to you. You're advising companies on geopolitical risk at McKinsey. At the boardroom, when you look at the geopolitical risks in front of you, very, very complex picture, how do companies navigate that?
Thanks, Michael. Well, I think, look, it starts with a very simple question that they're grappling with amidst this complexity. And I think it boils down to this. Can we remain global? And if so, how? The old model of being a global company is under strain because the world order is shifting in a sense. So if you start with that premise of can we remain global, and if so, how, thereafter, very quickly it turns to a set of, exactly as the speaker just said, a set of resilience measures that balance risk and opportunity. I think the first thing is for many companies that have not been steeped in this world of geopolitics, it starts by even just having an aligned understanding at the board level of the facts. So what I mean by that is not so much, I read this in The Economist, I had that interesting conversation, but is there a systematic way by which the board, which is global in its nature, has a clear picture of what are the top risks, what are the key developments, what are the implications. Having a team that supports the board with that granularity has become quite essential to understand the risk and setting aside managing, monitoring it. I think the second is the need to be much more forensic in how you operate in a country, right? So this idea that we are seeing countries swinging into one camp or the other is over. It is a more multipolar world. In one area, a country's interests may be aligned, in another not. So how do you operate in a more granular way? We see companies developing country risk frameworks that essentially talk about what are the activities that are red, we're just not going to go there for sanctions or other reasons. What is green, where we want to surge, and what's that big amorphous yellow category of kind of, you can put it in a shorthand, lawful but awful. The things that are legally permissible, but there are judgment calls to be made from a reputational point of view. So having that degree of forensic nature. Going back to that theme of can we remain global, and if so, how? The other lever that companies are playing with is how do we even just structure our business? What is the way in which we separate our tech stack, our legal entities, our R&D, our supply chain? How do we reconfigure that to build greater insulation? The last couple of things, Michael, that come up quite frequently. One is maybe a little bit surprising, the other less so, is people. There's an enormous amount of time that global organizations have to spend looking inwards and dealing with the fact that geopolitics is personal. Their own employees have strong views. They have grown up in a certain age, but there's a next generation of colleagues who may not see it that way. Where you sit is where you stand is the same. So how do you as an organization, as a leader, hold your enterprise together amidst the geopolitical fissures that very quickly find their way inside your organization? And then just the last thing, and this is truly one of the sort of the hardest parts of all of this, is scenario planning. It's a very easy thing to prescribe. And the way we talk about it is the need to think about the gray rhinos, which are the known risks charging our way. We've talked about them. The black swans, which are the unknown risks of high impacts. How do you even think about those? We haven't touched on places like North Korea and what is happening at the DMZ, where there's a lot of momentum, given North Korea's sort of resurgent relationship with Russia. But then there are also the silver lining. So this idea of how do you as a board step back and not do a 2023 or 2024 conversation, but take a longer gaze. And there was a reference to the Bletchley Summit, and it reminds me of this great quote from Alan Turing, that we can only see a short distance ahead, but in that we see that there's a great deal to be done. And that is the feeling in many boardrooms, that we don't quite know what we're up against, but we know there's a lot of work to be done to reconfigure the way we operate if we're going to find that opportunity and manage down that risk and effect.
Okay, final question to you, Ginny. We've talked about China growth, quality growth. The ambassador talked about it. There's some debate about whether it be 4.5%, 5% this year. But there's likely to be policy changes in China to drive that growth. What policy changes are you looking for? What would you expect? And what will the shape of policy be on those key issues by the end of this year?
Well, heading into 2 sessions, I think there's been a lot of interest. China is an anchor for not just regional but global growth, and that's why so many people are watching those policy announcements. But frankly, I think the key to China's growth, regardless of the number, the numerical number, is consistency. Ever since the onset of COVID, I think there has been really very, very steady policy tone, and that is commitment to not just monetary but fiscal support when necessary, and more importantly, targeted support. And China has really probably learnt from the kind of post-financial crisis years where, unlimited support for sectors just to produce growth is not good enough. I think the cost of that is very much, something that the future generations have to live with. So the current policy, I think, what we're looking for is policy coordination between monetary and fiscal. Monetary, we've already seen rate cutting. We keep cost of borrowing extremely low, and you're seeing the lowest cost of funding in China compared to anywhere else. And then the other most important thing, this is the interesting bit, is fiscal support.
Yeah.
Special purpose bonds being issued really for the purpose of delivering projects, and that's what's going to produce growth. And lastly, obviously, we're watching 2 sessions very closely, but I would imagine there will be a lot of emphasis on consumers. One of the highlights on the latest GDP and other economic data sets was actually the growth in disposable income accelerated beyond the percentage of GDP growth, 5.2. So actually it was above 6% growth, urban and rural. The unleashing of consumer power in China as China transitions towards a consumption-led economy is the one thing I think that will be extremely positive for the region, for the world. How can China's consumers really lift the world out of that low growth environment? So I think policy emphasis will not only looking at unleashing more consumption, but also to help consumers. So that comes down to health, welfare. With an aging population, it is absolutely crucial to unleash that consumption power by addressing some of those issues that are really deterring people from spending their disposable incomes.
I'm afraid we have to leave it there, ladies and gentlemen. Please thank Zayed Haider and Ginny Yan. Thank you both very much. I now want to look at the digital piece. Digital trade for Asia's economic growth in 2024 is critically important, and the rapid digitalization of the region will facilitate growth in regional trade. Now, there are a number of key technologies and applications that are central to this drive. Blockchain, which came up in the earlier discussion, that's one of them. To give a few examples, Vietnam is a leader in blockchain projects. It has about 200 active blockchain projects at the moment and has been deploying the technology in a number of functions. In China, the Ministry of Science and Technology recently approved the establishment of a national blockchain technology innovation center. The importance of central bank digital currencies was also highlighted in our report. And of course, there's AI, which has been a theme of many of the discussions today. The degree to which generative AI will actually increase productivity will be key to Asia's growth. Technology is one point, but also so is the regulation, the standardization, critically important to enable that growth. So let's discuss technology. Joining me now is Farisa Zaran, who's Global Head of Group Public and Regulatory Affairs at Standard Chartered Bank, and also Pamela Ma, Managing Director, Digital Standards Initiative, the International Chamber of Commerce. Please welcome my guests to the stage. Thank you both for being with us. Discussing technology in the space of 6 or 8 minutes is fairly tough, but Farisa, if I may start with you. 2 or 3 technologies that you think are crucial that you're looking at closely in terms, especially in terms of the Asia picture.
Well, first of all, thank you, Michael, for the invitation to come and share some thoughts. And it's lovely to be here, and Happy New Year, and happy preemptive Happy Year of the Dragon. I personally am really looking forward to the additional wisdom that was identified earlier. I think that it's Standard Chartered, as you know, is a trade bank. We also have a pretty large presence in some of the most dynamic economies in Asia. Hearing all of the conversations earlier, I'm really happy that we have a brand promise that's about being here for good, because if ever there's going to be a need to be here for good, it's now. The technology that we're talking about that is going to potentially turbocharge the growth potential in China, you've already talked about it in your report, which is, by the way, excellent. Thank you for sharing that. For me, the three that are incredibly important and really exciting to watch is the concept of data sharing, the infrastructure that's being built around it. We can talk a little bit about what that is and what it means. The second is blockchain, and just to kind of be really clear, blockchain is basically DLT technology, distributed ledger technology, which is not crypto assets, right? It's just we're super clear. It's crypto is obviously a part of it, but there is so much more that DLT does. It is basically a distributed ledger, which creates transparency, it creates stability, it's immutable, and the potential of addressing some of the most systemically important issues, such as fraud and the safety and soundness of transactions, is huge, and I think should be really, really considered and supported. And I'm happy to see that many economies in Asia are actually doing just that. And then the final area that I would highlight, because it's difficult not to highlight it, is generative AI. Post Davos, I don't know if there's any more to be said, but there's a lot it could do that could go bad, and we accept that. But there is a lot that it could do that could be really productive and incredibly exciting for us as a human species, but also as productive human beings in this planet. And so I think those are the three areas that we're really carefully watching and exploring as a bank, and trying to constructively participate in the conversations that are going on, developing the policy and the regulatory infrastructure, because it is being built as we speak, which is really dynamic and really exciting.
Pamela, that brings me to you. The standardization, harmonization, interoperability issue is live, it's prominent, it's important, but there still seems to be some distance between where the businesses and governments would like it to be and where it is now. What's your readout broadly on Asia, on where we stand on harmonization of regulations?
So I think I'll agree that Asia has put digital front and center
Yes.
of its growth strategies, and one of the keys to that, which I think most in Asia have actually committed to, is that the standards that they use should be globally interoperable, and to create that seamless flow of data across the supply chain. I think I'll agree with Farisa that a lot of technologies which she mentioned are going to be critical to that. Now, the key for Asia to make sure that digitalization and the rise and application of different technologies doesn't lead to more fragmentation, but instead drives towards inclusive growth, closing the trade finance gap, greater security, and verifiability of data along the supply chain, is standards. So I think the commitment is there, right? But it's getting to the application. One example is digital identity. There is a globally interoperable LEI, and I think the challenge is for states to be comfortable with adopting that and establishing some kind of mutual recognition system with their national digital identity schemes. For me, the one that I would add is actually digital identity, because that is the only way that enterprises can actually ascertain the true identity and credentials of their trading counterparts along the supply chain. Absolutely essential if we want to enable SMEs to be able to integrate. So yes, standards harmonization and simplification of the standards which are used along the supply chain is essential for SMEs to grow, and then digital identity. And then with regard to blockchain, I would say blockchain is a great tool for the supply chain, but it's not the only tool.
Yes,
There's
yes.
a lot of public key infrastructure that, that we should be developing, which will, for the first time, enable us to actually have scalable digital trust. So that's one of the things that is really key, which has driven the fact that you can't trust the data on the supply chain has driven the fact that we've created networks with very high walls, which are difficult for SMEs to penetrate.
Yes.
If we can verify and authenticate and trace the data as it flows up and down the supply chain, that will enable us to actually truly open up the trading system and really capitalize on the potential, which your report like really correctly outlines. The potential of Asia to drive global growth is huge. Now let's work hard to actually craft the right policy enabling environment to actually make that a reality.
Pamela talked about fragmentation. So Farisa, what is the policy approach? How does one approach policy given the technology is moving very rapidly? There are sort of fragmented, there are domestic political issues sometimes driving this. So looking at the overall policy vision, what's the approach one should take?
So I guess being a complete policy wonk and regulatory geek, I would say that the thing that I would notice about data and digital and all of the policy discussions are not that different from the discussions that are occurring in other parts of the world regarding financial system stability or trade stability, anything else. So the broad framework, when we think about it, and we're seeing fragmentation occur because there are essentially 4 or 5 competing and at times misaligned policy objectives that are interacting with one another when governments are putting out policy announcements. There's data privacy, there's national security interests, there's consumer protection interests, intellectual property and copyrights, competition, environmental impact, governance and broader market integrity, the list goes on, right? So as you look at the conversations that are occurring around regulating this incredibly consequential new area, they're not that different from the types of conversations that are occurring elsewhere, but they are really at times conflicting. The other thing I would identify as we think about the development of the policy context is that there are different instruments that governments and individuals use in forming the policy environment. There's obviously legislation, there's regulation, there's a supervision of entities that are regulated, and finally there's litigation, which we're starting to see very actively being used in certain areas, in AI, for example. And so as these things come together and interact with one another, you can see the potential for fragmenting to be fairly high. And so there is an incredible impetus in the business community as well as amongst governments to think creatively but also in a coordinated manner to make sure that these very legitimate policy objectives are addressed, but in a way that on the one hand balances, let's say, consumer protection, but on the other hand also recognizes that the need for customization and innovation is real for the growth potential of economies. And so how do you do that? It's not easy, right? I mean, and hats off to all governments that balance these competing objectives, but that is the ask on the table of how do we do this? And the concern is if we don't do this well, this great promise of growth is going to get thwarted, and these islands are going to be created that don't interact and don't really unlock the potential that Pamela's just been talking about.
Pamela, I'd like to talk to you just before we wrap up on the ASEAN Digital Economy Framework. I was in Jakarta for the summit, and I was struck that ASEAN brought forward those negotiations, which were only supposed to begin in 2025 to 2023. Does that demonstrate a commitment of ASEAN, at least, to accelerate and harmonise regulation? And do you see that as a positive step forward?
Yes, I do, because the number one of eight or nine points on the Digital Economy Framework Agreement is digital trade. Yeah. And the number one principle of digital trade is that data should be globally standardized and interoperable so that it can flow. I think ASEAN has been very ambitious to state a number about what they want their digital economy to be and to position trade front and center to achieve that. Actually, I think for ASEAN, they've moved beyond the why of digital trade. They're now asking how. Okay, so we're no longer in a discussion of like, why should you do this? What's the business case? How much economic growth? It's actually globally established. And I think, and we are actually working directly with ASEAN on establishing what is the roadmap for enabling the use of electronic transferable instruments on the supply chain. What is the role of government in enabling business to move towards globally interoperable standards? How do we establish industry convergence towards standards? We don't need new standards. We actually just need industry to converge toward them. And what are the other factors in the digitalization of trade which will enable Asia to bring down the cost of trade, which is currently running about twice that of Europe? You know, just the cost of administering and the time required to administer the intra-Asia supply chain. Not to mention, I mean, which is crucial because a lot of the trade in Asia is still intermediate. And as we've seen over the past year, that complexity and that adding steps is actually increasing. So the way to get the most out of trade growth in Asia is actually reduce the cost of the border. And I think this year is absolutely going to be super critical for ASEAN to actually begin to implement that vision of a globally harmonized, digitalized trading environment. And that actually, I think, can be a great example for other regions of the world which are struggling to really get a handle on the balance between trade openness and protecting the domestic economy because players inside are perceived as weak. So how do you use trade to really strengthen the indigenous enterprises and get that sustainable, inclusive growth that we're all wanting?
Look, I'm afraid we're out of time. It's a fantastic issue. We'd love to discuss it more, but we are out of time. Please thank Pamela Ma and Farisa Zarin. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you both very much. To wrap up today's event, it's my great pleasure to be in conversation with Dominic Barton. Dominic is chair of Rio Tinto, and before joining Rio Tinto, he was Canada's ambassador to China from September 2019 to the end of 2021, and previously spent more than 30 years at McKinsey, including 9 as a global managing partner. He had a number of senior leadership roles in Asia. He's advised companies across a whole range of sectors. He's won multiple awards and is on a number of international fora. Please welcome to the stage Dominic Barton. Dominic, thank you very much for being with us. Last time I heard you spoke, I think was, I'm almost certain, was a Mongolia Economic Forum. Right. And you spoke about the profound and rapid changes that are happening in the world. Now, if I recall correctly, and forgive me if I'm paraphrasing here, but number one was the climate challenge, which will require the greatest mobilization of capital the world's ever seen. The second was political fragmentation, and you talked then about extreme views becoming the mainstream. The third was technology, and we've just been talking about that, the rapid advancement in technology. And the final one was the shift of economic growth to Asia, that center of gravity shifting, and that's where I'd like to start the discussion. Our report suggests that's accelerating. Is that your reading of it?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you, Michael, for having me and being here with the ambassador and other ambassadors and friends, and Stephen. I've drank the Kool-Aid for too long because I lived in Asia for about 20 years of my life, in South Korea for 6 years, China for 10, and in Singapore for the remainder of that period. And I believe that the gravity of the economic gravity of the world has shifted. It's no longer it is shifting, it has shifted. We used to talk about it shifting in 2000. It has shifted. And I won't bore you with all the numbers. Some very good numbers have already been given. Stephen mentioned some, the ambassador and others, and your work. But you just think about it, that 2/3 of the world's middle class will be in Asia by 2030. Today it's about 56%, right, that's moving that way. If you think about the innovation, it's much more than just the scale and the GDP. You know, we've had close to 60% of the world's GDP growth from 2015 to 2021 was Asia. China's been 30% of that on a consistent basis. So it's not just the growth. If you peel beneath that level, you're talking about innovation. We don't talk enough about the innovation that's going on. Digital has been mentioned. You know, a third of China's retail sales are digital. That's double what's done in the US, and it continues to accelerate. So if you want to look at innovation and how we're going to be digital citizens, go to Asia. Don't it's not in North America. It's not in Europe. The cultural change I remember in South Korea when I was there, foreign movies weren't allowed. There was a worry about protecting the industry and where it was, and it's quite extraordinary today when you just see the impact, as Stephen mentioned, on that side. And then if you think on one of the first forces I mentioned in there is this climate change, which is it will lead to the single largest reallocation of human capital, of financial capital in history. The leadership of that is actually coming from Asia. There's a lot of people, a lot of us talk about what we need to do on climate change. If you actually look at the results of where it's happening in Asia. 50% of all the total global investment in renewable energy was done in China last year, and it's on track, I think, to be 56%. That's what's happening, and there's a lot that we all need to do and learn. But if you look at EVs, you just look at I think it's 1 in 4 cars now in China is an EV. It used to be 1 in 20 just 5 years ago. So there's, and then if I think about advanced manufacturing, the manufacturing core of the world has shifted from North America and Europe. It used to be about 50%. It's now 30%, and the vast bulk of that is now in Asia, but that's advancing. It's advanced manufacturing. And a shocking thing for me at Rio Tinto, after post-COVID, the teams have been able to travel more again, and it's been shocking to see the advances. We're seeing a lot of what's called the dark factories. What that means is there's no one in them. There's no human in them. It's completely automated. It's robotics and so forth. And we don't talk about that, and I think there's things that we can learn. So anyhow, I'm biased, but it's moving so quickly. And it's actually accelerating to your point.
Let's talk about China just a little more, because there's some debate about whether growth will be 5% or 4.5% this year. But the economy is growing. It's a very large economy. Where do you see the growth drivers in China? Is it around renewables? Is it around the climate challenge? Is it EVs?
It's always, I was taught once by a mentor. I asked him, if you could talk to your 21-year-old self, what would you tell that 21-year-old self? And he said, I'd learn to have a microscope in one eye and a telescope in the other and not get a headache, right? This sort of notion of, and I think it's important to think about what's going to happen in 2024, for sure. There's a lot of change, but it's also really important to think about the longer-term drivers. And so that's very much as a kind of a student of trying to understand China. I feel like I got to level 5 of 100 because it's complex, but if you look at it, the underlying drivers, there is a lot of challenge. There's no question about it, what's happening in the property market. But if you peel back and you look at the urbanization rate, urbanization today in China is 64%, right? If you compare that to what is happening in the US and Japan, where it's plus 85 plus, China's where the US was in the 1960s from an urbanization. And that's been a fundamental flywheel of the drive of the middle class. I'm not saying it's not like it was 20 years ago, but there's still a lot of room to move on that. It was mentioned before about the consumption side of things. China's consumption as a percent of GDP is about 38%. In the United States, it's 68%. That is going to get unlocked when the Chinese consumer begins to spend more, which they will as they move through it. As they you remember in COVID, Chinese did not get the COVID payments that we all saw in other parts of the world where there was that. So they didn't have that, but they've got an immense savings rate. There's a push to move people from property into broader savings and consumption. And so when I look at that potential from a 38% to 68%, even if it's half that, and you look at where that's moving, and you see it in the sports industry, right? Leisure and sports, one of the absolute fastest growing areas in the world is actually in China. You mentioned obviously on the green tech and so forth that's moving on. Silver care, right? This is a immense opportunity. As I get older, the more excited I am about the innovation that's going to be needed. We need that in there, but this is a very significant growth area. And then you see a much more integrated Asia. Again, when I first moved to Asia, and this is a very Western thing to say, when I went to South Korea in 1996, and one of my Japanese mentors said to me, you know, by the way, Dom, Asia is a Western invention. I was, what are you talking? He said, we aren't actually all that connected and so forth. And I don't think he was right, but what was right was there weren't all the trade routes and the supply chains. And this now is a very integrated region. You know, you think about, there are 80 trade routes in the world, big ones. 49 of them have Asia at an end of that. 22 of them are within the place. So it's much more integrated, and you're getting a lot of innovation going on between the countries. Southeast Asia, China, India, it's all, and then we mentioned before, I think we shouldn't forget about West Asia, which I call the Middle East, right, where there's a huge amount of change going on in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, from, again, a capital point of view, but also working with other countries.
No doubt. I mean, there's a bit of work we do, what we dub the Middle East pivot to Asia, and the increase in trade, the increase in business and commercial relationships, of geopolitical exchanges, the regulatory shifts in the Middle East around business, the social change that's happening. If you go to Saudi Riyadh now, completely different from 5 years ago. But that sort of, the growth of different regions, is that a product of the realities of where populations sit? Is it a product of political fragmentation? Is it a product of the fact that there's a demographic, you know, Asia's demographics tend to be younger?
Yeah, I think it's probably a combination of them all. I mean, I fundamentally think there's been the demographics. And again, you've had this, we've got over 60% of the world's population that's there. But I also think there's been more long-term policy across the region. You know, that certainly in China, definitely in South Korea, Singapore, Indonesia, which is a country that's not talked about enough. That has just had a consistent, wonderfully high growth rate. Everyone's like, well, we've got to be careful about Indonesia. It's, you know, what's going to happen. People have a historic view, but there's been long-term, so policy consistency allows business to be able to be focused, to make the investments that they need to do. As I said, in our business, we're a 20 to 30 year time frame. It matters to us, this length of view. And I think that's allowed, you know, again, through that, the consistent policy for more people, the investment in infrastructure. There's been a massive amount of investment in infrastructure, which has led to the supply chains that are actually efficient. And I think the digitization's the next step in that. But the infrastructure that's been built has actually made companies much more efficient. So the platforms have been in place to be able to then build the company. So I think there's a population. You know, there's Africa, which again I'm optimistic long term. Yes. It's got a large population. It hasn't been developed. So I think there is something about consistent policy, trade. You know, this real focus on trade, and a huge focus on education. You know, people don't realize that if you look at the top 50 universities in the world, the number of the top universities that now come from Asia in that. There's just I always believe, you know, there's that Maslowian hierarchy of needs in the West where nutrition, food is first. This is a very simplistic view. I always felt in many parts of Asia, I think the first is education, then food. You know, let's educate. And then, so there's this, I think, drive that has led to that.
Final question. As chair of Rio Tinto, and you said you've got 20, 30-year time horizons, which some companies don't. Some looking at quarterly results and final end-of-year results. But as chair of Rio Tinto in an ever-complex world, you must do scenario planning for how you see the world shaping up. Some I've spoken to have said this is going to be one of the toughest years on record because of the unpredictability of the news agenda, because of the multiple elections and the lack of continuity that's possible because of technology and the like. What's your readout broadly on 2024? A time of rapid transformation, time of deep uncertainty? When you talk to your board, how is it your position?
Well, I found that panel on risk very helpful. Right, I think there is more volatility, and the way I sort of look at the world is the probability curve has flattened. You know, if we thought this was a normal and we were more around here, it's flattened. It's fat tail, the opportunities and risk. That's why I personally think I'm a frightened optimist, if you know how you and where things are. But for us, we have to have that long view, short view. So we're looking at where the demand is for our product, and we're also looking at the sourcing of where it is, and that politics is not going to change that. The minerals are where they are. I'd love the minerals to be in Switzerland, but they're not. They're in complicated. So we have to recognize that they're not necessarily in the most straightforward of life. But that's what we need to do. But we know where the demand. So we know that. I think the issue in the year is resilience. How do we deal with a shock where someone may say you can't do that, or you need? That's what we have to be prepared to do. And if we focus too much on the short term, it's not going to be good for the long term. And of course, if we just are thinking about what happens out there, not here, we're not. So there is a notion of, scenario planning. What would we do? Do we have the resilience? What's our balance sheet look like? How much of a shock can we withstand? What partnerships do we have? Partnerships, I think, are incredibly important in this world. Collaborating with other groups. And then engaging. We have to, the travel schedule is intense because we have to be, for us, Rio Tinto, Asia is extremely important to us. China, we've of Mongolia, Australia. I love Indonesia. I think is more important. North America is important to us. One of the largest sort of employee bases is actually in Canada on the aluminum side. The United States represents significant opportunity for actually mining, if we're allowed to do on that front. And then there's Africa. So we're kind of sprawled, but we have to engage and make sure people understand what it is that we're trying to do in a biased way. Try and explain. We think, even though it may sound like a very boring, mundane area, minerals matter, and this is why we do it. So it's kind of resilience in the short term, but keeping that long-term focus about where we want to be. So it's a delicate, I hope we get it right, it's a delicate balance.
We have to leave it there. Please thank Dominic Barton.
Thank you.
Look, I just want to thank all of you for being here. It's been a fantastic discussion. Thank you to His Excellency and to Anne-Marie Trevelyan for their speeches. Thanks to our panelists. Thanks to Dominic. And thanks to you all. Please take a look at the report. I hope you enjoy it. Please give us any feedback you have. We look forward to seeing you very soon. Take very good care. Goodbye for now.